The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly as Nathaniel Xander pressed a dampened cloth against the mangled flesh of his face, the pain a dull reminder of the life he'd left behind. It was 1876, 2 years since the fire that had claimed his family's ranch and marked him forever, both inside and out. The burns that twisted across the right side of his face had become his identity in a world that valued appearances almost as much as it valued a man's ability with a six-shooter. The small frontier town of Redemption Creek hadn't seen a new face in months, which made his arrival all the more conspicuous as he guided his dappled gray stallion down the dusty main street. Women gathered their children closer as he passed. Men stared with unflinching directness, some with hands hovering near their holsters. Nathaniel kept his hat pulled low, his scarred side tilted away from curious onlookers, a habit formed from countless hostile reactions. "Water for your horse, mister?" A stable boy no older than 14 approached, his eyes darting between Nathaniel's visible profile and the ground. "Much obliged," Nathaniel replied, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of someone who rarely spoke. He dismounted with practiced ease, boots landing with a soft thud in the dirt. He handed the boy a coin. "Got a stall free?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Hamilton just cleared out yesterday." The boy took the reins, still carefully avoiding looking directly at Nathaniel's face. "You staying long?" Nathaniel shrugged, adjusting his hat lower. "Long as it takes." He'd come to Redemption Creek with purpose. The telegram folded in his breast pocket spoke of cattle rustling and a ranch owner in need of experienced hands. After 2 years of drifting, taking whatever work would have him despite the way people recoiled at his scars, the possibility of steady employment drew him like water in the desert. The Whistling Rock Saloon stood at the far end of the street, its weathered sign creaking in the hot afternoon breeze. Nathaniel pushed through the batwing doors, instantly assaulted by the thick haze of cigar smoke and the pungent smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies. Conversations faltered as heads turned toward him, the typical reaction that followed him everywhere. He ordered whiskey, keeping his scarred profile away from the bartender, and retreated to a corner table where shadows might offer some reprieve from staring eyes. The saloon gradually returned to its normal volume as patrons returned to their drinks and card games, though occasional glances were still cast his way. It was there, nursing his second drink, that Nathaniel first saw her. Lillian Whitaker moved through the saloon with a quiet authority that seemed at odds with the raucous establishment. Unlike the painted women who worked the floor, she wore a simple dress of deep blue, her chestnut hair swept up in a practical style that accentuated the elegant line of her neck. What caught his attention most wasn't her beauty, though she possessed that in abundance, but the ledger she carried, the way she spoke to the barkeep with the confidence of someone who belonged. When she approached his table, Nathaniel instinctively shifted to hide his scars. "Mr. Xander?" she asked, her voice carrying the refined tones of Eastern education beneath a subtle Western lilt. Nathaniel stiffened, surprised at being addressed by name. "Yes, madam. I'm Lillian Whitaker. I sent the telegram about the position at Whitaker Ranch." She gestured to the chair across from him. "May I?" He nodded, still keeping his face averted, wondering how she had known who he was. As she settled into the chair, he caught the faint scent of lavender, so out of place in the tobacco-filled saloon that it momentarily distracted him. "I appreciate you coming all this way," she continued. "Your former employer in Laramie spoke highly of your abilities. Mrs. Peterson wrote to you?" Nathaniel asked, surprised that the widow whose small ranch he'd helped manage would have reached out. "She did." Lillian's eyes, a clear hazel that reminded him of sun-dappled creek water, watched him steadily. "Said you were the most capable foreman she'd ever had, despite being half the age of most." Nathaniel nodded, uncomfortable with both the praise and the scrutiny. He shifted again, turning further away. "Mr. Xander," Lillian said softly, "I can only see half of what you're saying." The comment, delivered without pity or revulsion, caught him off guard. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned to face her directly, bracing himself for the inevitable reaction: the widened eyes, the quick intake of breath, the poorly disguised horror. Instead, Lillian Whitaker simply met his gaze, her expression unchanged as she took in the twisted scar tissue that covered the right side of his face, pulling his eye into a permanent squint and distorting his once straight nose. "That's better," she said matter-of-factly. "Now about the rustlers. They've hit 3 times in the past month. My father passed last winter, and word's gotten around that a woman alone is running Whitaker Ranch." Nathaniel struggled to follow her words, distracted by her lack of reaction to his appearance. "Your foreman couldn't handle it." A flash of pain crossed her features. "He was shot during the last raid, died 2 days later." "I'm sorry to hear that," Nathaniel said, genuinely sympathetic. "How many head have you lost?" "Nearly 40. We can't afford to lose any more." Her hands, he noticed, weren't the soft, pampered hands of an Eastern lady. They bore the calluses and small scars of ranch work. "I need someone who knows cattle and can handle a gun if necessary." "And you think that's me?" Lillian leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Peterson seems to think so." "And right now, I don't have many options." Nathaniel considered her offer. He'd been drifting long enough, taking odd jobs that barely kept him fed, sleeping under stars more often than not. The prospect of steady work, a purpose beyond mere survival, pulled at something inside him he thought had died in the fire along with his family. "When do we start?" he asked finally. The ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Tomorrow, first light." She rose from the table with fluid grace. "There's a room above the general store that goes with the position. Mr. Jenkins will show you up." As she turned to leave, Nathaniel found himself speaking again. "Miss Whitaker," she paused, looking back at him with those clear hazel eyes. "Most folks, they have trouble looking at me." He gestured vaguely toward his scarred face, the statement both question and observation. Lillian regarded him thoughtfully. "My father always said it's what's beneath the skin that matters, Mr. Xander." Then, with a nod that somehow conveyed both respect and dismissal, she departed, leaving Nathaniel staring after her, feeling as though something fundamental had shifted in his world. The morning dawned with the particular golden clarity unique to the high plains, the air still cool from the night as Nathaniel saddled his horse outside the general store. He'd slept better than expected in the small room, which, though sparse, offered more comfort than he'd known in months. The shopkeeper's wife had even left a plate of biscuits outside his door, a kindness that had caught him off guard. Lillian Whitaker was already mounted on a spirited chestnut mare when he rode up to the arranged meeting place at the edge of town. She wore practical riding clothes, split skirts, and a man's shirt under a fitted vest that raised Nathaniel's estimation of her practicality. "Ready, Mr. Xander?" she asked, adjusting her hat against the rising sun. "Lead the way, Miss Whitaker." The Whitaker Ranch lay 7 miles northwest of Redemption Creek, nestled against foothills that eventually rose to become part of the distant mountain range. As they rode, Lillian pointed out landmarks and boundaries, speaking with evident pride of the land her father had established 20 years earlier. "My mother died bringing me into this world," she explained as they crested a rise that revealed the full expanse of the property below. "It was just father and me out here until I was 12. Then he sent me back east to my aunt for schooling." "But you came back," Nathaniel observed, noting how at ease she seemed in the saddle, how her eyes constantly scanned the horizon in the instinctive vigilance of someone born to ranch life. "I was never meant for drawing rooms and tea parties," she said with a small smile. "I lasted 6 years before I convinced father I'd learned enough to be a proper lady, came home and never left again." The ranch house itself was modest but well built, with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides and sturdy corrals nearby. Several outbuildings formed a rough semicircle behind the main house, and beyond them stretched grazing land where cattle dotted the landscape like dark stones on a green canvas. As they approached, 3 men emerged from the bunkhouse, their stances wary as they took in Nathaniel. The oldest, a weather-beaten man with a silver-streaked beard, stepped forward. "This him, Miss Lily?" he asked, eyes narrowed as he assessed Nathaniel. "This is Mr. Xander," Lillian confirmed, dismounting with practiced ease. "He'll be taking over as foreman." The old cowhand didn't bother hiding his skepticism as his gaze lingered on Nathaniel's scarred face. "No offense, mister, but we need someone who can stand against these rustlers. They ain't playing gentle." Nathaniel dismounted slowly, meeting the man's gaze directly. "And what makes you think I can't, Hank?" Lillian said, a warning in her tone. "Mr. Xander comes highly recommended." "By who?" One of the younger hands muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Nathaniel's hand moved to his saddlebag, retrieving a Winchester rifle with practiced ease. Without breaking eye contact with the skeptical cowhand, he chambered a round, turned and fired at a tin can perched on a fence post nearly 50 yards away. The can flew into the air. Before it could hit the ground, Nathaniel fired twice more, each bullet striking the can mid-air, keeping it aloft until the third shot sent it spinning into the distance. A hushed silence fell over the group. "That answer your question?" Nathaniel asked quietly, lowering the rifle. The old cowhand Hank gave a grudging nod. "Shooting's one thing, leading men's another." "I don't need your friendship," Nathaniel replied evenly. "Just your respect and your work. You give me those and we'll get along fine." Lillian watched the exchange with undisguised interest, a hint of approval in her eyes. "Hank, show Mr. Xander around the property. Pete, Miguel back to repairing that south fence." Her tone brooked no argument, and the men dispersed to their tasks without further comment. Over the next week, Nathaniel settled into his role with methodical determination. He rose before dawn each day, checking stock, planning work rotations, and riding the boundaries. The hands, while initially standoffish, gradually warmed to his quiet competence and fair treatment. Even Hank, the most skeptical, began to defer to Nathaniel's judgment after he successfully tracked and recovered 3 stray calves that had wandered into a box canyon. What Nathaniel couldn't quite figure out was Lillian Whitaker. She worked alongside her men, mending fences, doctoring sick calves, and breaking horses with a skill that put some of the hands to shame. Yet there were moments when he caught glimpses of another side to her, like when she sat on the porch in the evening with a book of poetry, or when she hummed classical pieces as she tended the small kitchen garden. It was during the second week that the rustlers struck again. Nathaniel was awakened just after midnight by urgent pounding on his door. He opened it to find Pete, one of the younger hands, breathless and wide-eyed. "Riders on the North Ridge," Pete gasped. "Moving a small herd toward Broken Jaw Pass." Nathaniel was already pulling on his boots. "How many?" "5, maybe 6. Miss Whitaker's already saddling up." That stopped Nathaniel cold. "She what?" By the time he reached the corral, Lillian was indeed mounted, a rifle across her saddle, giving instructions to Hank and Miguel. "Miss Whitaker," Nathaniel called, striding toward her, "you can't be serious about joining this chase." Her eyes flashed in the moonlight. "This is my ranch, Mr. Xander, my cattle." "And my job to protect them," he countered, quickly saddling his gray. "You hired me for exactly this purpose." "I hired you to lead, not to order me about on my own property." There was steel in her voice that matched the determined set of her jaw. Nathaniel recognized the futility of arguing further. "Stay behind me," he said finally, swinging into the saddle. "And if shooting starts, you find cover immediately." She didn't respond directly, but the slight inclination of her head was acknowledgement enough. They rode hard through the night, following the trail of the rustlers toward the jagged silhouette of Broken Jaw Pass. The moon, nearly full, cast enough light to navigate by, though it also meant they would be visible to anyone watching the back trail. As they neared the pass, Nathaniel signaled for the group to slow, then halt in a copse of trees. "They'll have someone watching," he whispered, dismounting. "We need to approach from different angles." He quickly outlined a plan. Hank and Miguel would circle wide to the east, cutting off the exit from the pass if the rustlers tried to double back. Pete would stay with the horses while Nathaniel and Lillian would approach on foot to assess the situation. "I still think you should stay back," Nathaniel told Lillian as they crept forward through scrub brush. "And I think you should focus on the rustlers instead of me," she replied, though her voice held no anger, only grim determination. They reached a rocky outcropping that provided a view into the narrow pass. Below, 5 men had corralled about 20 head of cattle, the Whitaker brand visible on their flanks even in the moonlight. The rustlers were working quickly, rebranding the cattle with hot irons. "Simmons brand," Lillian whispered, identifying the new mark being burned into the cattle. "Clayton Simmons has been trying to buy my land for months." Nathaniel studied the scene, counting weapons, noting positions. "When I give the signal, Hank and Miguel will block the exit. We'll call down, give them a chance to surrender." "And if they don't?" Lillian asked. Nathaniel's hand moved to his holster. "Then we do what's necessary." Their eyes met in the darkness, an understanding passing between them that went beyond words. For all her education and refinement, Lillian Whitaker was a woman of the frontier. She knew what necessary meant. Nathaniel fired a single shot into the air, the signal for Hank and Miguel. The effect below was immediate. The rustlers dropped their irons, reaching for weapons as they scanned the ridgelines. "You're surrounded," Nathaniel called down, his voice echoing in the pass. "Drop your weapons and step away from the cattle." A moment of tense silence followed, broken by a sudden volley of gunfire as 2 of the rustlers opened fire on their position. Nathaniel pulled Lillian down behind the rocks as bullets chipped stone around them. "So much for the peaceful approach," she muttered, checking her rifle. "Stay down," Nathaniel ordered, then moved to a better position, returning fire with careful, measured shots. One of the rustlers fell, clutching his shoulder. The firefight continued for several minutes, neither side gaining a clear advantage. From his position, Nathaniel could see Hank and Miguel pinned down by one of the rustlers, while the remaining 3 used the cattle for cover, making it difficult to target them without risking the livestock. Suddenly, a cry of alarm from behind made Nathaniel whirl around. A 6th rustler, previously unseen, had circled behind them and now held Lillian at gunpoint, his arm wrapped around her throat. "Drop it, Scarface," the man growled, pressing his revolver against Lillian's temple. Nathaniel froze, his mind racing through options, each more desperate than the last. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his weapon. "Let her go," he said evenly. "Your quarrel's not with her," the rustler laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the pass. "My quarrel's with anyone who gets between me and profit." He began backing away, dragging Lillian with him. "You boys keep them busy," he called to his companions below. "I'm taking this one as insurance." What happened next unfolded so quickly that later, Nathaniel would struggle to piece it together in sequence. As the rustler dragged Lillian backward, she suddenly went limp, dropping her weight and throwing him off balance. In that split second of confusion, she drove her elbow hard into his midsection, then twisted out of his grasp. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. The moment Lillian was clear, his gun was up and firing. The rustler fell backward, a look of surprise frozen on his face as a crimson stain spread across his chest. Below, the remaining rustlers, seeing their advantage lost, attempted to flee, only to ride directly into Hank and Miguel's line of fire. In the confusion, one escaped, but the others were either wounded or surrendered. In the aftermath, as they secured the prisoners and gathered the scattered cattle, Nathaniel found Lillian sitting alone on a boulder, staring at the lightening eastern horizon. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink that seemed obscenely beautiful after the violence of the night. "Are you hurt?" he asked, approaching cautiously. She shook her head, not looking at him. "No, just thinking." Nathaniel stood awkwardly, uncertain whether to leave her to her thoughts or offer some kind of comfort. Before he could decide, she spoke again. "Have you ever killed a man before tonight, Mr. Xander?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. "Yes," he answered simply. She nodded as if confirming something to herself. I thought as much. There's a steadiness to your hand that speaks of experience. Finally, she turned to look at him, her face pale in the early light. Does it ever get easier? No, Nathaniel said honestly, and it shouldn't. Something in his response seemed to reassure her. She stood, brushing dust from her clothes with hands that trembled only slightly. Thank you for saving my life. You saved your own life, he corrected. I just finished what you started. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Perhaps we saved each other then. She started toward the horses, then paused, looking back at him. I think it's time you called me Lillian, don't you? Miss Whitaker seems rather formal after all this. The ride back to the ranch was subdued, the men and cattle both exhausted from the night's ordeal. The prisoners' 3 wounded rustlers were tied to their horses, their expressions sullen with defeat. The 4th man, the one who had held Lillian at gunpoint, they'd buried in a shallow grave marked only by a pile of stones. Sheriff Thomas Morris from Redemption Creek arrived by mid-afternoon, alerted by Pete who'd been sent ahead. A taciturn man with a reputation for fairness, he took statements from everyone involved and examined the altered brands on the recovered cattle. Clayton Simmons, you say? He asked Lillian, scratching notes in a small book. Got any proof beyond the brand? One of the men admitted it, Nathaniel interjected. Said Simmons was paying $50 a head, no questions asked. Morris nodded thoughtfully. Simmons has friends in the territorial court, going to need more than one rustler's word. Then get a confession from the man himself, Lillian suggested, her voice steady despite the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. These men will testify to save their own necks. Maybe, the sheriff allowed. I'll ride out to the Simmons spread tomorrow, ask some questions. He tucked his notebook away. In the meantime, might want to double your night watch. That one that got away will likely report back to his boss. After the sheriff departed with the prisoners, the ranch settled into an uneasy calm. Nathaniel organized the hands into rotating watches, positioning them at strategic points around the property. If Simmons attempted retaliation, they would be ready. That evening, as darkness fell, Nathaniel found himself on the porch of the main house, watching the first stars appear in the deepening blue of the sky. The door opened behind him, and Lillian emerged carrying 2 cups of coffee. I thought you might need this, she said, offering him one of the steaming mugs. It's going to be a long night. Nathaniel accepted the coffee with murmured thanks, appreciating the rich aroma that cut through the coolness of the evening air. They stood in companionable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. May I ask you something? Lillian finally said, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. Nathaniel tensed slightly, anticipating the question that inevitably came about his scars, about what had happened to his face. It always came eventually, even from those who initially pretended not to notice. How did you learn to shoot like that? The question, so different from what he expected, momentarily threw him. My father, he answered after a moment. He was a cavalry officer before he took up ranching, believed a man should know how to defend what's his. Lillian nodded, sipping her coffee. My father taught me too. Said a woman alone on the frontier needed to be twice as capable as any man. A soft laugh escaped her. My aunt was horrified when she discovered I could outshoot most of the young gentlemen in Philadelphia. I can imagine, Nathaniel said, finding himself smiling slightly at the image of a younger Lillian scandalizing proper society. What brought you out west? She asked. Originally, I mean. Nathaniel looked out over the darkened landscape, considering how much to share. I was born out here, he said finally. My father came west after the war, met my mother in Colorado. They built a ranch north of Laramie. The memories rose unbidden of summer evenings much like this one, his mother's voice calling him in from chores, his father's large, calloused hands showing him how to mend a bridle. And the fire, Lillian asked gently, surprising him again with her perceptiveness. Mrs. Peterson mentioned there was a fire. Nathaniel's hand involuntarily rose to the scarred side of his face. 2 years ago, lightning struck during a drought. The barn went up first. He swallowed hard, the familiar pain tightening his throat. My parents were inside trying to save the horses. Lillian's hand touched his arm briefly, a gesture of sympathy that held no pity. I'm sorry. I tried to reach them, he continued, the words coming more easily than they ever had before. Got as far as the doorway before a beam fell. Next thing I remember is waking up 3 days later at a neighbor's house. The silence that followed felt cleansing somehow, as if speaking the words had released something tight within him. Lillian didn't offer platitudes or empty consolations, and for that, Nathaniel was profoundly grateful. Sometimes I think the hardest part of grief isn't the loss itself, she said eventually. It's learning to carry it with you every day afterward. Nathaniel looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw in her clear eyes an understanding born of her own losses, her mother, her father, perhaps others he didn't yet know about. In that moment, something shifted between them, a connection forming that transcended the employer-employee relationship they'd maintained until now. It gets lighter, he said, echoing words Mrs. Peterson had once told him. Not smaller but lighter, more bearable. Lillian nodded, her gaze meeting his without flinching, without the quick aversion he'd grown accustomed to. Yes, it does. She finished her coffee and set the cup on the porch railing. I should let you get to your watch. Thank you, Nathaniel. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice followed him into the darkness long after she'd gone inside. The next few days passed in a heightened state of vigilance. Sheriff Morris returned with news that Clayton Simmons had mysteriously departed for Denver on urgent business the morning after the failed rustling attempt. While this temporarily eased immediate concerns about retaliation, it also meant that the mastermind behind the rustling had, for now at least, escaped justice. He'll be back, Hank predicted grimly as they repaired a section of fence near the eastern boundary. Men like Simmons don't give up on what they want. And what does he want? Nathaniel asked, driving a post into the hard ground with powerful strokes of a mallet. Seems there's easier ways to acquire cattle than stealing them. Hank paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. Ain't about the cattle, it's about the water. Nathaniel stopped, looking at the older man with renewed interest. Water? Miss Lily's land controls access to the best water source for miles around. 3 creeks converge on her property, forming a year-round stream that never runs dry, even in the worst droughts. Hank gestured toward the distant line of cottonwoods that marked the watercourse. Simmons has been trying to buy her out since before Mr. Whitaker passed. Offered fair price too, but the old man wouldn't sell. And Lillian won't either, Nathaniel surmised. This land is in her blood, Hank said simply. Her daddy's buried on that hill yonder alongside where her mama's been resting these 30 years. He resumed his work, threading wire through the post. Besides, she knows what Simmons really wants. Once he controls the water, he controls every rancher for 20 miles in any direction. The conversation gave Nathaniel a new perspective on the situation, and on Lillian's determination to hold onto her ranch at all costs. It wasn't merely sentiment or stubbornness. It was a responsibility to the entire community that depended on fair access to the water that flowed through Whitaker land. That evening, when Lillian announced her intention to ride into town the following day for supplies, Nathaniel immediately volunteered to accompany her. I'm perfectly capable of making the trip alone, she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. I've been doing it for years. I don't doubt your capability, Nathaniel replied evenly. But with Simmons' men still possibly in the area, it's sensible to have company. Her expression softened slightly. Very well, Mr. Xander, we'll leave at first light. They set out as dawn broke over the eastern plains, the morning air crisp and invigorating. Nathaniel found himself enjoying the ride more than he'd anticipated. Away from the ranch and its constant demands, Lillian seemed more relaxed, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's history. "That ridge there," she said, indicating a rocky outcropping to the north, was where the Cheyenne used to conduct their summer ceremonies. "My father maintained good relations with them even when other settlers were calling for their removal." "That couldn't have been popular," Nathaniel observed. "It wasn't," she agreed. "But father believed in respecting those who came before us. He learned their language, traded fairly with them. When the government tried to force them onto reservations, he spoke on their behalf at territorial meetings." Pride colored her voice. "He taught me that true strength isn't about domination but coexistence." As they rode into Redemption Creek, Nathaniel noticed a subtle change in Lillian's demeanor. Her spine straightened almost imperceptibly, her expression becoming more guarded. He understood immediately this was her public face, the one she presented to a world that scrutinized her every move as a woman managing a ranch alone. Their first stop was Sheriff Morris's office, where Lillian inquired about any news regarding Simmons. The sheriff had little to report, though he confirmed that 2 of the captured rustlers had indeed implicated Simmons in exchange for reduced sentences. "Not enough for an arrest warrant," Morris admitted. "Not without more substantial evidence." "So he gets away with it," Lillian said, her frustration evident. "For now," the sheriff conceded. "But men like that eventually make mistakes. When he does, we'll be waiting." From there, they proceeded to the general store, where Lillian handed over a substantial list of supplies to Mr. Jenkins. As the shopkeeper bustled about filling the order, Nathaniel noticed the way other customers watched Lillian, some with open curiosity, others with thinly veiled disapproval. "Mrs. Hargrove," Lillian greeted an elderly woman selecting fabric at a nearby counter. "How is your granddaughter faring with her new baby?" the old woman sniffed dismissively. "As well as can be expected, I suppose, with her husband being such a poor provider." Her gaze flickered to Nathaniel, lingering on his scarred face before returning to Lillian. "I see you've hired new help. Rather unusual looking, isn't he?" Nathaniel stiffened, though the comment was hardly the most offensive he'd heard. What surprised him was Lillian's response. "Mr. Xander is my foreman," she said, her voice cool but polite, "and one of the most capable men I've had the privilege of employing. His appearance is of no consequence compared to his character." Mrs. Hargrove's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Well, I'm sure you know best, my dear. Though a woman in your position should be concerned with appearances." She gathered her purchases. "The Ladies' Aid Society is meeting on Wednesday. We'd be pleased if you join us." "Thank you for the invitation," Lillian replied with practiced graciousness. Unfortunately, ranch work leaves little time for social engagements. After the woman departed, Nathaniel caught Lillian's eye. "You didn't have to defend me." "I wasn't defending you," she said simply. "I was stating facts." She turned back to Mr. Jenkins, continuing their transaction as if the exchange had never occurred. By the time they'd completed their shopping, loaded the supplies into the wagon Jenkins had provided, and eaten a quick meal at the small cafe near the livery, the afternoon was well advanced. Dark clouds had gathered on the western horizon, promising a summer storm. "We should start back," Nathaniel suggested, eyeing the approaching weather. "Looks like a big one brewing." Lillian nodded agreement, but as they prepared to leave town, a commotion near the bank caught their attention. A crowd had gathered, voices raised in alarm and excitement. "What's happening?" Lillian asked a passing townsman. "Bank robbery," the man reported breathlessly. "3 men rode in not 20 minutes ago, cleaned out the safe, and shot Mr. Pearson, the teller." Nathaniel exchanged a glance with Lillian. "Which way did they go?" "Headed west, toward Broken Jaw Pass," the man replied. "Sheriff's gathering a posse now." A grim realization settled over Nathaniel. "That's the direction of your ranch." Lillian's face paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "They might just be using the pass as an escape route." "Maybe," Nathaniel conceded, though he didn't believe it for a moment. The timing was too convenient, the direction too specific. "But we should get back just in case." They set out immediately, pushing their horses harder than was wise given the approaching storm and the loaded wagon. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing steadily closer as dark clouds swallowed the afternoon sun. The first fat raindrops began to fall when they were still 3 miles from the ranch, quickly becoming a downpour that reduced visibility to mere yards. "We need to find shelter," Nathaniel called over the howl of the wind. "There's an old line shack just ahead." Lillian shouted back, pointing toward a barely visible structure nestled against a rocky hillside. They reached the shelter just as lightning split the sky, a deafening crack that spooked the horses. Nathaniel helped Lillian secure the animals under a crude lean-to attached to the shack. Then they hurried inside, soaked to the skin and shivering. The interior was a single room, dusty but dry, with a small stone fireplace against one wall and a narrow cot in the corner. Nathaniel immediately set about building a fire while Lillian wrung water from her hair and clothing. "My father built these lined shacks every few miles," she explained, watching as Nathaniel coaxed flames from the dry kindling he'd found stacked by the hearth. For the hands to use during bad weather or when working distant sections. The fire caught, casting flickering light and blessed warmth into the small space. Outside, the storm raged, rain lashing against the single window and wind finding every crack in the aged wooden walls. "We'll wait it out here," Nathaniel decided, standing back from the growing fire. "No sense risking the horses in this." Lillian nodded agreement, moving closer to the fire and extending her hands toward its warmth. In the dancing light, with her hair falling in damp waves around her shoulders and her clothes clinging to her slender frame, she looked younger, more vulnerable than the capable rancher he'd come to know. "You're worried about the ranch," he observed, noting the tension in her posture. "Hank and the others are capable," she said, though her eyes remained troubled. "But if those bank robbers are headed there—" "They're after Simmons," Nathaniel said with sudden certainty. "The timing, the direction, it makes sense. He's back from Denver and making his move." Lillian looked at him sharply. "You think the bank robbery was a distraction? I think it's too coincidental." Nathaniel moved to the window, trying to gauge the storm's progress through the rain-streaked glass. "With the sheriff and any able men from town occupied with the chase, your ranch would be vulnerable." "Except they wouldn't know we were in town," Lillian pointed out. "Unless they've been watching," Nathaniel countered. "Tracking your movements, waiting for an opportunity." The implication hung in the air between them, made more ominous by a crash of thunder that shook the small building to its foundations. Lillian shivered, whether from cold or fear, Nathaniel couldn't tell. "Here," he said, shrugging out of his coat which the fire had nearly dried. "Take this." "I'm fine," she insisted, but he draped it around her shoulders anyway, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "Lillian," he said quietly, "whatever happens, I won't let them take your ranch from you." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Why does it matter so much to you?" It was a fair question, one Nathaniel had been asking himself with increasing frequency. Why did he care so deeply about this ranch, this woman? He'd signed on for a job, nothing more, yet somehow along the way Lillian Whitaker's fight had become his own. "Because you trusted me," he said finally. "When most people can't see past this," he gestured toward his scarred face, "you saw something else." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken thoughts and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Then Lillian reached up, her fingers gently touching the twisted flesh of his cheek. Nathaniel instinctively started to pull away, a reaction born of years of seeing revulsion in others' eyes, but her gaze held him steady. "What I see," she said softly, "is a man who has suffered, yet still finds the strength to help others. Who treats people fairly regardless of their station. Who rides toward danger rather than away from it." Her hand remained against his face, warm and unhesitating. "The scars are just part of your story, Nathaniel. They're not who you are." Something broke open inside him at her words, a dam holding back emotions he'd refused to acknowledge for too long. Before he could think better of it, Nathaniel leaned down and kissed her, a gentle meeting of lips that asked a question neither of them had dared to voice. Lillian answered by winding her arms around his neck, drawing him closer as the kiss deepened into something more urgent, more profound. The storm outside mirrored the one within Nathaniel's heart, wild, uncontrollable, and somehow perfect in its intensity. When they finally parted, both breathless, the world seemed to have shifted on its axis. Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. "I never thought." He began. "Nor did I," she whispered, her fingers tracing the line where his scars met unmarked skin. "But perhaps some things don't require thinking." The storm raged on, but within the small shack. A different kind of tempest had been unleashed, one that neither of them had anticipated, but that now seemed as inevitable as the changing seasons. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world and muddy trails that would slow their progress back to the ranch. They set out at first light, the air between them charged with something new and fragile. Neither spoke of what had transpired in the lined shack, though their glances held a warmth that hadn't been there before. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the Whitaker ranch, Lillian suddenly reined in her horse, her body going rigid with tension. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice tight with alarm, "look." Below them, the ranch was a scene of controlled chaos. Several men on horseback circled the main house, while others appeared to be herding cattle toward the western boundary. Even at this distance, Nathaniel could make out Hank and the other hands, apparently being held at gunpoint near the corral. "Simmons," Lillian breathed, her hands tightening on the reins until her knuckles whitened. Nathaniel quickly assessed the situation. "I count 8 men plus Simmons." He pointed to a figure on a large bay horse, directing operations from a position near the house. "They're moving your cattle, probably planning to drive them to his property before anyone realizes what's happening." "We have to stop them," Lillian said, already reaching for her rifle. "Wait," Nathaniel cautioned, catching her arm. "We're outnumbered, we need a plan." She hesitated, clearly struggling between the urge for immediate action and the wisdom of his words. "What do you suggest?" Nathaniel studied the layout, his mind racing through possibilities. "The creek bed," he said finally, pointing to where a dry wash ran along the eastern edge of the property. "It's deep enough to provide cover. We can use it to get close to the house without being seen." Lillian nodded, her expression settling into grim determination. "And then we create a diversion," Nathaniel said, outlining a risky but potentially effective strategy that would utilize their limited resources to maximum effect. 20 minutes later, they had abandoned the wagon and maneuvered their horses down into the creek bed, approaching the ranch house from the blind side. The banks of the wash were steep enough to conceal their movement, though the going was slow and treacherous, with loose rocks threatening to give away their position with every step. As they drew closer, voices became audible, Simmons giving orders to his men, the occasional protest from one of the Whitaker hands, quickly silenced by threats. Through gaps in the bank, Nathaniel could see that the situation was deteriorating. 2 of Simmons' men were now setting up what appeared to be dynamite charges near the main corral, clearly intending to destroy what they couldn't steal. "They're going to blow my ranch apart," Lillian whispered, horror evident in her voice. "Not if we stop them first," Nathaniel replied with more confidence than he felt. "Remember the plan. You circle around to the barn. When you hear my shot, free the hands if you can. If not, start a fire in the hay storage that will draw some of them away." "And you?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "I'm going after Simmons," he said simply. "Cut off the head and the body falls." Lillian's hand found his, squeezing briefly. "Be careful. You too." He hesitated, then pulled her to him for one swift, fierce kiss. "When this is over, we have things to discuss." A fleeting smile touched her lips. "Yes, we do." Then they separated, Lillian moving silently along the creek bed toward the rear of the barn while Nathaniel continued toward a position that would give him a clear line of sight to Simmons. He found it behind a woodpile at the edge of the yard, close enough to hear Simmons berating one of his men for being too gentle with the captured ranch hands. "I don't care if you have to shoot one to motivate the others," Simmons was saying, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern privilege overlaid with frontier harshness. "Get those cattle moving before the sheriff figures out our little deception." Nathaniel carefully positioned himself, steadying his rifle against a log. Simmons sat astride his horse in the center of the yard, a commanding presence in an expensive coat despite the early hour and recent storm. Flanking him were 2 armed men, while the others were distributed around the property, some guarding the Whitaker hands, others working with the cattle. Taking a deep breath, Nathaniel sighted down the barrel, aiming not at Simmons himself but at the hat perched on his head. The shot rang out, clear and sharp in the morning air, sending the hat flying and causing Simmons to nearly fall from his startled horse. Instant chaos erupted. Simmons' men whirled in confusion, guns drawn but with no clear target. Simmons himself ducked low over his horse's neck, shouting orders that were lost in the commotion. From the direction of the barn came the distinctive crackling of flames taking hold in dry hay, followed by shouts of alarm. Several of the gunmen immediately ran toward the new threat, exactly as Nathaniel had hoped. He used the confusion to move to a new position, firing twice more to maintain the illusion of multiple attackers. One of Simmons' men went down, clutching his shoulder, while another dove for cover behind a water trough. Near the corral, Nathaniel caught a glimpse of Lillian leading Hank and the others away from their captors, taking advantage of the distraction to arm themselves from a hidden cache beneath the barn floorboards. Within moments, the odds had shifted dramatically. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as the ranch hands took up defensive positions around the property. Nathaniel kept moving, working his way closer to Simmons, who had retreated to the relative safety of the main house porch. What followed was a pitched battle that lasted nearly 20 minutes. Simmons' men, realizing they'd lost their advantage, began to fall back, several abandoning the fight entirely and fleeing toward the western boundary. Others continued to exchange fire with the ranch hands, using outbuildings and corrals for cover. Nathaniel, focused entirely on reaching Simmons, almost didn't see the gunman who stepped out from behind the corner of the house. A bullet whistled past his ear, close enough that he felt the displacement of air. He dropped and rolled, returning fire instinctively. His shot went wide, but it drove his attacker back into cover. "Xander," Simmons' voice called out from the porch. "That's your name, isn't it?" The scarred drifter Miss Whitaker took in like a stray dog. Nathaniel didn't respond, using the man's desire to talk as an opportunity to move closer, sliding from the shadow of a rain barrel to the deeper darkness beneath the porch steps. "I know you can hear me," Simmons continued. "I'm offering you a deal. Walk away now and I'll pay you twice whatever she's giving you. This isn't your fight." From his position below the porch, Nathaniel could see Simmons' boots pacing back and forth on the weathered boards above. The man was alone, his remaining supporters engaged elsewhere. "You're wrong," Nathaniel called back, his voice seemingly coming from a different direction thanks to the shelter of the porch. "It became my fight when you decided to take what isn't yours." "Everything has a price," Simmons replied, his tone dismissive. "Land, cattle, loyalty, it's just a matter of finding the right number. Even that scarred face of yours probably has a price. Medical treatments in Europe, perhaps? I could arrange it." Nathaniel moved silently to the side of the porch, positioning himself for a clear shot up through the railing. "Some things aren't for sale, Simmons." "Every man has his price," Simmons insisted, moving closer to the edge of the porch, trying to locate Nathaniel's position. "Even you." "Not me," Nathaniel said, rising suddenly to confront Simmons face to face, his gun leveled steadily. "And certainly not her." Simmons froze, his own weapon half raised, caught in the moment of indecision that often separated survivors from the dead in such confrontations. "You die for her land," he asked incredulously. For her principles, Nathaniel corrected. For her right to choose her own path. Drop the gun, Simmons, it's over. For a tense moment, it seemed Simmons might risk the shot, his eyes calculating distances and odds. Then, slowly, his expression shifted to one of grudging acknowledgement. He lowered his weapon. You know this isn't the end, he said as Nathaniel relieved him of the gun. I have friends in the territorial court. Yes, we know, Nathaniel interrupted, turning the man around to bind his hands with a length of rope from his pocket. But attempted murder and cattle rustling are difficult charges to dismiss, even for friends in high places. By the time Sheriff Morris arrived, drawn by reports from townspeople who had seen smoke rising from the direction of the Whitaker ranch, the situation was well in hand. 3 of Simmons' men were dead, 2 more wounded and under guard, and the remainder had fled. Simmons himself sat bound to a chair on his own porch, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief at how thoroughly his plans had unraveled. Quite a morning you've had, Morris observed dryly as he surveyed the damage. The barn's hay storage was a loss, but quick action had prevented the fire from spreading to the main structure. Several fence sections would need replacing, and one of the corrals had been partially destroyed by a dynamite charge that had detonated during the confusion. Could have been worse, Nathaniel replied, wiping soot from his face with a bandana. No one on our side was seriously hurt. And the cattle, all accounted for, Lillian said, joining them. She had a smudge of dirt across one cheek and her clothes were torn in places, but her eyes shone with the particular satisfaction of having defended what was hers. Hank and the boys are bringing back the last of them now. Morris nodded approvingly. I'll need statements from everyone, he said, all business now. And I'll be taking Simmons and his men back to town for arraignment. With the bank robbery connection, this time the charges should stick. As the sheriff went to organize the transport of his prisoners, Lillian turned to Nathaniel, studying him with an intensity that made his heart quicken despite his exhaustion. You were right, she said simply. About all of it. Not all of it, he replied, gesturing toward his face. Simmons was wrong about this having a price. Lillian stepped closer, her hand rising to touch the scarred side of his face with the same lack of hesitation she'd shown in the lined shack. Because it's beyond price, she said softly. It's part of who you are, Nathaniel, and who you are is. She paused, searching for the right words. Who you are is someone I've come to care for very deeply. The admission, spoken in the clear light of day amid the aftermath of violence, held a weight and significance that transcended the passion they'd shared during the storm. This was a declaration, a beginning. I never thought I'd find a place to belong again, Nathaniel said, his voice rough with emotion. Not after the fire, not looking like this. Do you feel like you belong here? Lillian asked, her eyes never leaving his. Nathaniel looked around at the ranch, at the land stretching toward distant horizons, at the hands going about the business of restoration, and finally back at the remarkable woman before him. Yes, he said simply, if you want me to. I want you to, she confirmed, a smile breaking across her face like sunrise. Very much. There was more to say, plans to make, decisions to consider, but for now this acknowledgement was enough. They stood together on the porch of the home she had fought to protect, watching as Sheriff Morris and his deputies departed with their prisoners, the future stretching before them like an unwritten page. In the weeks that followed, life at the Whitaker ranch settled into a new rhythm. The damage from Simmons' attack was repaired, the cattle recovered from their ordeal, and the daily work of the ranch continued. News arrived from town that Simmons and his associates had been formally charged with multiple crimes, including the bank robbery that had been planned as a diversion. With several of his men turning state's evidence in exchange for leniency, even Simmons' influential friends couldn't shield him from the consequences of his actions. For Nathaniel, the most profound change was internal. The wary defensiveness that had been his companion since the fire began to ease, replaced by a cautious optimism he hadn't thought possible. His relationship with Lillian deepened, though they kept it discreet out of respect for propriety and the potential for gossip that might undermine her authority with the hands. It was on a warm evening in late summer, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, that Lillian broached a subject that had been on both their minds. "People are talking," she said, her tone matter-of-fact rather than concerned. "Mrs. Hargrove made a point of telling me that my situation was becoming a topic of discussion at the Ladies' Aid Society." Nathaniel tensed slightly. "Your situation? An unmarried woman living under the same roof as her foreman," Lillian clarified, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Apparently, it's causing quite the scandal." "I could move back to the bunkhouse," Nathaniel offered, though the thought of returning to the cramped quarters he'd occupied before Simmons' attack held little appeal. In the aftermath of that day, it had seemed natural for him to take the spare room in the main house, given his role in the ranch's security. Lillian shook her head, turning to face him fully. "That's not the solution I had in mind." "What then?" he asked, though something in her expression made his heart beat faster with anticipation. "I was thinking," she said carefully, "that there might be a way to silence the gossips and make our arrangement more permanent." Nathaniel found himself momentarily speechless, searching her face for confirmation of what she seemed to be suggesting. "Lillian, are you asking?" "I'm asking if you would consider becoming more than my foreman," she said, her directness one of the many qualities he'd come to love about her. "If you would consider becoming my husband." The word hung in the air between them, laden with meaning and possibility. Nathaniel reached for her hand, enveloping it in both of his. "Most women expect to be asked," he said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I've never been most women," she reminded him, her own smile echoing his. "And you haven't answered my question." Nathaniel looked out at the land that had become his home, then back at the woman who had made it possible. "Yes," he said simply, the single word carrying the weight of everything he felt for her. "Yes, I would be honored to be your husband." Lillian's smile bloomed into something radiant. "Even knowing that people will talk, that they'll wonder what you see in me or what I see in you." "Let them wonder," Nathaniel said, drawing her closer. "I don't mind what the world sees as long as you see me." "I do see you," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face, her fingers tracing both the scarred and unmarked skin with equal tenderness. "I've always seen you." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher who visited Redemption Creek monthly. The entire ranch turned out for the occasion, along with a surprising number of townspeople whose curiosity or genuine goodwill overcame whatever reservations they might have had about the match. Mrs. Hargrove, notably, presented them with a hand-stitched quilt of remarkable craftsmanship, telling Lillian in a stage whisper that she'd always admired a woman who knew her own mind. Sheriff Morris served as witness, his normally taciturn expression softened by evident approval. As autumn gave way to winter, the newlyweds settled into a partnership that extended beyond the personal to encompass every aspect of ranch life. Nathaniel's experience complemented Lillian's intimate knowledge of the land, while her connections in the community opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed to a scarred stranger. Together, they implemented innovations that increased the ranch's productivity, improved breeding stock, more efficient irrigation systems, strategic partnerships with neighboring ranchers who preferred cooperation to Simmons' brand of cutthroat competition. The Whitaker-Xander Ranch, as it came to be known, began to thrive as it hadn't since before Lillian's father fell ill. Winter brought heavy snowfall that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time, but the cozy evenings spent planning for spring, reading aloud by the fire, or simply enjoying each other's company made the isolation feel like a gift rather than a hardship. It was during one such evening, as wind howled around the eaves and snow piled against the windows, that Lillian shared news that would change their lives once again. "Nathaniel," she said, setting aside the book they'd been taking turns reading, "there's something I need to tell you." He looked up from the harness he was mending, instantly alert to the subtle shift in her tone. "What is it?" A smile spread across her face, tentative but radiant. "It seems our family will be growing by one come summer." For a moment, Nathaniel couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotions he hadn't expected to feel again after losing everything in the fire. Joy, certainly, but also a profound sense of continuity of life persisting, renewing, moving forward despite past tragedies. "A baby," he finally managed, setting aside the harness and moving to kneel before her chair. "Our baby," Lillian nodded, taking his hands and placing them gently on her still flat abdomen. "Our baby." Nathaniel leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers in a gesture that had become a private ritual between them, an acknowledgement of connection deeper than words could express. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted softly. "A home, a family, you." "Nor did I," Lillian replied, her fingers threading through his hair. "After Father died, I thought my future would be managing the ranch alone, fighting men like Simmons, growing old with only memories for company." She drew back slightly, meeting his gaze with the clear-eyed honesty he treasured. "You changed everything, Nathaniel. We changed everything," he corrected gently. "Together." As spring returned to the land, bringing new grass and calves, wildflowers, and lengthening days, Lillian's condition became increasingly evident. The hands treated her with a protective deference that amused her even as she insisted on continuing her usual activities, modified only as necessity dictated. Nathaniel found himself experiencing the world anew through the lens of impending fatherhood. Every decision, every improvement to the ranch, every interaction with the community now carried the weight of legacy of creating something that would outlast him, that would provide security and opportunity for his child. Their son was born on a perfect summer evening, with the help of the midwife from town and Hank's wife, who had raised 5 children of her own. They named him Thomas, after Lillian's father, and in the quiet hours of his first night, as Nathaniel held his sleeping son while Lillian rested, he felt the final pieces of his broken heart heal and reform into something stronger than before. "He has your eyes," Lillian observed softly from the bed, watching them with tired contentment. "And your determination," Nathaniel replied with a smile, noting how the infant's tiny hands curled into resolute fists even in sleep. "He'll be stubborn." "With us as parents, how could he be anything else?" Lillian laughed, the sound carrying all the joy and exhaustion of new motherhood. Nathaniel carefully returned the baby to her arms, then sat on the edge of the bed, watching as his son instinctively nuzzled closer to his mother. "Thank you," he said simply, the words inadequate to express the depth of his gratitude for her love, for their child, for the life they'd built together. Lillian's free hand found his, their fingers intertwining with familiar ease. "For what?" "For seeing me," he said, echoing the words that had become a touchstone between them. "When no one else could." "Always," she promised, her eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the window. "I will always see you, Nathaniel, and so will he." As if in response, the baby stirred, his tiny face turning toward the sound of his father's voice. One day, Nathaniel knew, his son would ask about the scars children always did, with the unfiltered curiosity of innocence. And when that day came, he would tell the story not as one of loss and pain, but as the beginning of the journey that had led him to this moment, to this family, to this love that had healed him more completely than any doctor ever could. Outside, the night was alive with the sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses in the corral, the whisper of wind through cottonwoods along the creek. Sounds of home, sounds of belonging, sounds of a future that stretched before them, rich with possibility. Nathaniel leaned down to kiss Lillian's forehead, then the soft crown of his son's head, his heart full to overflowing with a happiness he had once thought forever beyond his reach. The scars remained, would always remain, a map of where he had been. but they no longer defined where he was going. In the years that followed, the Whitaker-Xander Ranch flourished, becoming one of the most respected operations in the territory. Thomas grew into a strong, curious boy with his mother's intellect and his father's steady temperament. He was joined 2 years later by a sister, Emma, whose arrival completed their family in ways they hadn't known were missing. Clayton Simmons eventually served 5 years in the territorial prison before being released, a broken man whose influence had waned during his absence. When he returned to the area, it was as a chastened figure who avoided the Whitaker-Xander family and eventually sold his holdings to a cattle company from the east before departing for California. Redemption Creek grew from a frontier outpost to a proper town with a schoolhouse where Lillian occasionally taught lessons in literature and history, sharing her Eastern education with a new generation. Nathaniel became a respected figure in local governance, his fair-mindedness and practical wisdom sought after in disputes and planning decisions. And if people sometimes still looked twice at the scars that marked his face, neither Nathaniel nor Lillian paid it any mind. For they had learned together that true vision comes not from the eyes but from the heart, and that some marks, whether visible or hidden, are not disfigurements but testaments to survival, to resilience, to the capacity of the human spirit to emerge from fire not destroyed, but transformed.